Is it really worth to pay 4 times more for a watch that supposedly does the same and looks the same? I mean, does the price gap really justify the quality gap between luxury and affordable watch brands in general? And if so, to what degree? Well, to answer this question, I had to recall some of my first-hand experiences from the past, which I'm sure will at least answer some of these questions. First, I want to clarify that what I'm sharing today is based on insights gathered over 20 years as a watchmaker, but also from working across different departments within the watch industry. And these insights are based on patterns that kept repeating themselves over the years. So, it's not based on just a few isolated experiences, but on consistent tendencies I observed again and again throughout the industry. Therefore, these are clear patterns that helps put into perspective where those quality gaps between luxury and affordable watches really lie. Well, first of all, what actually is quality? And I'm not talking about a dictionary definition here, but rather what quality means in the real world. Generally speaking, quality is associated with how good the product actually is based on three main areas. How reliable it functions, how well it is manufactured, which means how consistent across the whole watch, but also the brand itself, and lastly, how durable it is over the long term. But when it comes to functionality, this is technically measurable, meaning either a watch and its functions work properly or they do not, which is clear and logical so far. What I mean is based purely on this criteria, two watches from completely different price categories could technically fulfill the exact same requirements and at least on paper be considered equal. And this is actually what people mean when they say my 2K watch or my $500 watch does the same job as a 10K watch. Yes, I get it, and you can actually apply the same logic to almost every purchase, because once you move away from the phone as a pure time-telling tool, it becomes impossible to measure whether the price increase is really worth it. But what we can do is look for patterns in manufacturing quality that point toward clear differences in consistency between an affordable watch and a luxury watch, differences that are genuinely difficult to deny. Well, where do those differences actually lie, and what did I notice after all these years? I remember when I worked in sales as a watchmaker, we received new watches from the brands, but before we displayed the watches for sale, I would often receive multiple watches from the same brand and sometimes of the exact same model. Part of the process was doing the so-called entry check, where I would go through all the settings, test the clasp, check the bezel, and generally inspect how everything functions. And one thing I noticed more often than people would probably expect was how different some of these watches in the affordable price range behaved despite being the same model. For example, the way the clasp closed could feel completely different from one watch to another, or the finishing of the watch was not the same across all other watches. Sometimes the time setting or the date setting felt heavier or lighter, the bezel could have more or less play, the date window would not always be centered, and in worst case scenarios, I mean, even the dial printing showed visible differences, just a few to mention. What you also would notice, and something I tried to explain last time, is that when resizing the bracelet, some pins required noticeably more force to remove from the links than others, and sometimes some screws were sitting deeper than others, which leads to the conclusion that either the pins themselves did not have exactly the same tolerances, or the holes within the links were slightly in dimension. Lastly, also worth mentioning is that depending on the price range within these brands, the quality gap between a Longines Ultra Chron or a Classic would be huge, while with luxury brands, regardless of the model, the quality is way more consistent. And those differences became even more noticeable when a watch had, let's say, a case or bracelet with both polished and matte surfaces, sharp edges and defined corners. Because I think the real difference in quality becomes visible once you compare an entry-level watch to a luxury watch with more complex shapes, since the more complex design is, the harder it is for lower priced watches to maintain flawless execution. I especially noticed this in highly polished surfaces where reflection often showed slight distortions or so-called waves that only become visible from certain angles. So yes, in short, this type of issues were generally way more common in affordable watches than in higher priced ones. But important to mention here is that they were not necessarily related to a specific brand, but a general tendency with the affordable price range. And look, the thing is, of course, this is not visible to the buyer since, I mean, he doesn't have a reference point. And I think this is why people miss that there is a way more consistency within higher priced watches. But still does not mean you would never find any flaws within higher priced watches. But then I would say it was more of a rare mistake rather than a tendency in terms of manufacturing, if that makes sense. This also suggests that there is indeed a difference in how things are manufactured when comparing higher priced watches to affordable ones. I mean, because there is, of course, no way this happens purely by chance. This is another thing that I mentioned last week when I said tighter tolerances, which means at luxury brands, usually the rejection rate is way higher, and that's why these brands are way more consistent, but we will get into that later. And one last thing I really came to realize after all this years handling all kinds of watches is that, in my opinion, the most consistency is found within the 5K to 10K range. I feel like once you cross the 10K range, it's absolutely not about quality anymore, but more about scarcity, craftsmanship, exclusivity, and the emotional aspect behind them. Now, what I said so far, I would say makes sense and is expected, otherwise the price gap would not be justified at all. But where things take a turn and honestly get confusing is when it comes to reliability and movements. Well, one thing is undeniable: if your watch contains an in-house movement, you got something exclusive, but to what degree is there a quality gap compared to watches containing a third-party movement? The short answer is, based on what I have experienced, the quality of a movement has absolutely nothing to do with whether it is an in-house or not, because you would notice that nearly all entry-level watches using movements such as Selita or ETA would be at least as reliable as higher-priced watches using in-house movements. And if any of those entry-level watches using ETA movements had reliability issues, it was usually because they used an added module, included certain modification, or suffered from poor assembly and casing. For example, the hands were mounted too tightly or were touching the crystal, or movement holders applying too much pressure on the movement. But while this again ties back to the consistency issues I mentioned earlier, as a matter of fact, there were a few brands using in-house movements that had far more issues when it came to the technical aspects and long-term reliability. But this is not representative of the industry as a whole and should be seen as an exception rather than a rule. But how can we explain that? Well, all in-house movements that tended to cause trouble shared very similar characteristics, and it wasn't a matter of quality. For instance, they either had experimental features, a higher complexity, were still quite new to the market with little time for refinement, were very thin, or were produced in limited numbers. To be honest, I think this experimental stuff and this always introducing something new is a part of the result of the pressure on luxury brands, because they constantly need to introduce something new or offer something an ETA movement can't, since they are already often criticized for the idea that you're paying more for marketing than for actual substance. So going back to why issues in in-house movements are often linked to the characteristics I mentioned earlier, a clear counter example is the exceptional reliability seen in brands like Rolex, Omega, or Zenith, because their movements are mass-produced and highly industrialized, but more importantly, movements that have been refined over decades and continuously improved over time. By the way, before I forgot, one important advance that the majority of in-house movements have compared to third-party, even though this also depends a bit on the brand, is the accuracy within in-house movements stayed generally closer to the tolerances stated on their websites. And I think that it really comes down to luxury brands normally using actual people and more manual controls when checking the watches. On the other hand, a disadvantage of in-house movements, especially among smaller brands, is serviceability, because you're often paying way more for the after-sales support. Repair times can be significantly longer, and the servicing is frequently restricted to certified watchmakers, brand retailers, or official service centers. On top of that, independent watchmakers often do not have access to spare parts, which further limits repair options and increases dependency on the brand. So all of this, I think, is really important to know before buying a luxury watch and should not be underestimated. In short, I would say in terms of consistency, finishing, and the overall approach to manufacturing, a luxury watch can justify the price gap to a certain degree because there is without a doubt a tangible and visible benefit there, even though at some point that also reaches a threshold. But when it comes to reliability and pure functionality and in-house movement, and a higher price tag do not automatically guarantee a superior performance, which also means that from a purely functional perspective, the price gap often does not fully make sense. I have to clearly mention that what I have explained so far can't be applied to all the brands because, look, there are some outlaws in the industry, watches carrying the price tag of a luxury piece while offering little to no tangible advantages in finishing, consistency, movement quality, nor craftsmanship. And in many ways, I think these are the brands that created a certain level of distrust among enthusiasts and blurred the meaning of what luxury actually stands for, while taking attention away from other brands that genuinely deserve the label through real watchmaking achievements. And I'm pretty sure some of you already have a few names in mind, so I'm curious to hear them. So for today, one last thing that I want to touch on is where does the price difference actually come from? Is it really only marketing, and what influences a price besides scarcity, demand, and branding? Something that explains the price gap, even though it is justified to a certain degree, is how things are actually made, and that also explains the higher consistency you see within luxury brands. Because as I mentioned earlier, this consistency is not by chance. It comes from significant effort, and it closely is tied to how these watches are actually made. First of all, within the luxury brands, the rejection rate during the manufacturing is much higher. And it is something that I tried to explain earlier. It means for a watch to pass, every detail has to meet very strict tolerances. And if it isn't, the piece is rejected and does not leave the production and is lost money. The other thing is, while machines can handle a certain level of inspections, at some point, human judgment is still required. That's why within luxury brands, there are simply more people involved in the process, and most importantly, far more intermediate steps in the manufacturing process. And I remember this very clearly from my time working for a sub-company, Frank Muller, where we assembled for them the watches. And you know, I had to check every single movement manually, and if it didn't meet the tolerances, I had to adjust all of them. We would then repeat the same process after casing, and if anything changed in terms of tolerances, accuracy, or functionality, the process would start over again. And you know, the same process applies to the finishing of the case and in general other components. Then we still have not spoken about that during the manufacturing process, every additional material adds extra cost. For instance, if you use a gold oscillator, gold numerals, and so on. Now, if you add on top of all of this the in-house movement, which costs a tremendous amount to manufacture, regardless of to what degree parts are outsourced, and combine it with all the other aspects of production mentioned earlier, you start to understand that these prices are not as out of the blue as some people suggest. Yes, of course, it's undeniable that for Rolex, IWC, Omega, and all these brands, you pay for sure way more for the marketing as for a Tissot. But still, I think the problem some people have with this is they can't really imagine the cost of all of this behind. And I was one of them until one day I went for lunch with the Cyrus founder who worked for the same retailer as me. Because it was a time where I was really considering launching a watch brand, and I was glad to get some insights from someone who had done that before, especially regarding what to expect in terms of cost. And he explained that even something that seems like a minor change, such as introducing new material for the balance spring or making small technical changes on, let's say, the barrel, can easily reach seven-figure costs. This also puts R&D in luxury watchmaking into a new perspective, which is often kept within the brand's own facilities. That means you need full-time engineers, scientists, and testing labs that all have to be maintained and continuously be funded. Of course, everything I have explained doesn't apply equally to all luxury brands, which is, I think, very important to mention here. I mean, you can't directly compare a brand like Rolex, which is far more vertically integrated in this regard, while, let's say, brands like IWC or Breguet can rely more on shared resources within their respective groups. And one last point related to manufacturing that I really want to highlight, and I think many underestimate, is that improvements in quality are not linear to cost. This is also why some watches can seem, extremely overpriced at first glance, but there is a deeper explanation behind it. For example, let's say going from 50 to 80% quality is very noticeable and relatively cheap. But then I think from 80 to 90, it becomes much more expensive, even though the improvement is only 10% and often doesn't feel proportional to the price increase. And I think this also explains why some people asked last week, is the Rolex Submariner really 4 times better? Well, based on that logic, a Longines Hydro Conquest would be twice as good as the Certino DS Action, just because it costs about twice as much. Even though both share very similar cost structures, features, and are largely comparable in terms of quality. Can you factually prove it? Of course not, because now we are entering a philosophical territory. Because the thing is this, even if we took two watches from completely two different price ranges and compared them side by side in the lab, and even if I could prove that the luxury watch is 4 times or 5 times better, there's still the question, is it really worth 4 times or 5 times the higher price tag? Also ask myself, when would the Submariner actually be 4 times better to you? What would it need to have to be worth the extra price? And no, this is not a rhetorical question. I'm really curious to hear your answers. Before we wrap it up here, speaking of these two watches, something I have not told you yet, but the initial idea was to do a side-by-side comparison of the Longines Hydro Conquest and the Submariner. But not just talk randomly about them while I hold them in my hand, but rather put them under the 2 times or 4 times magnification macro lens, do some tests and see what the actual differences really are. So I reached out to some friends in the industry and some retailers. And at the beginning, everyone was super hyped and excited and said, sure, great idea to have a watchmaker review it. But once I told them about the concept, guess what? They all turned their backs and said, listen, we don't see any value in this. We want to sell it. And most importantly, we don't want to get in trouble. It's sad because I really believe that would have been a great video to do comparison from a watchmaker's perspective. And who knows, maybe I would have proven myself wrong and realized that the gap is actually much closer than it seemed to me when I had the first hands-on experience with the Longines. With that said, that's it for today. I hope that today's video helped shed some light on this topic and answer at least some of your questions. If there is still anything you would like to know in more detail, let me know at any time. I'll do my best to answer it. But for now, thank you for tuning in today. Wish you all a good start into the new week. Stay blessed and see you next time.